In a small, quiet town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, there stood an old courthouse. Its brick walls were weathered with age, and its wooden doors creaked when opened, but it remained the heart of the community, a place where disputes were settled, justice was served, or so people believed. Inside this courthouse sat Judge Richard Langley, a man whose stern face and cold demeanor struck fear into anyone who dared step foot in his courtroom. To some, he was a symbol of authority. To others, he was nothing more than a bully hiding. Behind his gavel, Judge Langley had earned quite the reputation over the years. He wasn't known for being fair or compassionate. Those qualities seemed lost on him. Instead, he prided himself on speed and efficiency, often rushing through cases without giving them much thought. His sharp tongue cut deep, leaving defendants humiliated and attorneys scrambling to keep up with his impatient pace. Many whispered that he enjoyed wielding power, relishing the way people squirmed under his gaze. Some even joked that if you wanted mercy, you'd have better luck rolling dice than appearing before Judge Langley. On one particular morning, the air inside the courthouse felt unusually tense. The benches were filled with spectators waiting for their turn to face the judge, while court staff bustled about organizing files and ensuring everything ran smoothly. Among those waiting patiently was an elderly man named Harold Whitaker. Dressed in a modest yet neatly pressed suit, Harold looked like someone who belonged in another era. His silver hair was combed back neatly, his glasses perched firmly on. His nose and his hands rested gently on the handle of a cane beside him. Despite his frail appearance, there was something striking about him, an air of quiet confidence that made heads turn as he entered the room. Harold had come to the courthouse not because he sought trouble, but because he found himself caught in what he considered a ridiculous misunderstanding. A few days earlier, he had been enjoying a peaceful stroll through the local park, feeding ducks by the pond and marveling at the beauty of nature around him. As he walked along the path, he noticed a discarded candy wrapper lying near a bench. Being the conscientious citizen he was, Harold picked it up and carried it toward a nearby trash bin. But just as he reached the bin, a park ranger approached him, accusing him of littering based on a misinterpretation of events. No matter how Harold tried to explain, the ranger insisted on issuing him a citation, which led to today's hearing. As Harold waited for his name to be called, he observed the proceedings with keen interest. Case after case unfolded before him, each handled with alarming swiftness. One woman was fined heavily for parking in a no-stopping zone, despite claiming her car had broken down. Another man received a harsh reprimand for failing to produce proper documentation for a minor zoning issue. Through it all, Judge Langley barely glanced at the defendants, dismissing their explanations with curt remarks and banging his gavel loudly to signal the end of each case. It was clear that he viewed these matters as inconveniences rather than opportunities to dispense true justice. Finally, the clerk called out, "Case number 47, State versus Harold Whitaker." Slowly rising from his seat, Harold made his way to the front of the courtroom, leaning slightly on his cane for support. The murmurs among the spectators grew louder as they took in his dignified presence. Even Judge Langley paused momentarily, perhaps noticing the calm resolve in Harold's eyes. Still, the judge quickly masked any curiosity with his usual scowl, shuffling through papers until he located the file related to Harold's case. The prosecutor, a young man eager to impress, the intimidating judge, began laying out the charges against Harold. According to the report, Harold had been seen throwing trash on the ground in the park, violating municipal ordinances designed to maintain cleanliness and order. The evidence consisted solely of the park ranger's testimony and a hastily written citation. As the prosecutor droned on, Harold listened intently, nodding occasionally as if piecing together a puzzle in his mind. When it came time for him to respond, Harold didn't raise his voice or display anger. Instead, he simply adjusted his glasses and prepared to address the court, not as a frightened defendant, but as someone who understood the law far better than most. What happened next would leave everyone in the courtroom speechless and set off a chain of events that neither Harold nor Judge Langley could have anticipated. Little did anyone know, this seemingly ordinary day in court was about to become anything but ordinary. When it was finally Harold's turn to speak, the courtroom fell silent. Everyone leaned forward slightly, curiosity piqued by the calm demeanor of this elderly man who didn't seem fazed by the imposing figure of Judge Langley or the gravity of the situation. Harold cleared his throat softly, adjusted his glasses once more, and began to address the court, not with emotion or defensiveness, but with a level-headed clarity that immediately commanded attention. "Your Honor," Harold started, his voice steady and measured, "I appreciate the opportunity to clarify the events in question. While I understand the importance of maintaining cleanliness in public spaces, I must point out that the charge against me is based on a misunderstanding." He paused briefly, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "The ordinance cited in this case defines littering as the act of discarding waste carelessly in an unauthorized area. However, what occurred here was quite the opposite. I picked up trash from the ground and placed it into a proper receptacle." As Harold spoke, he began dissecting the legal language of the municipal code with precision. He pointed out specific sections of the ordinance, explaining how they applied, or rather, didn't apply, to his actions. His tone remained respectful, yet there was no mistaking the authority behind his words. It was as though he were teaching a class instead of defending himself in court. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing nervously at Judge Langley while members of the audience exchanged bewildered looks. No one expected such a detailed and articulate response from the unassuming elderly man standing before them. But Harold wasn't finished. With the ease of someone who had spent decades mastering the intricacies of law, he went on to highlight inconsistencies in the way the citation had been issued. "Furthermore," he said, "the park ranger's account fails to align with the actual requirements of the ordinance. For instance, there is no mention of intent in the report, an essential element when determining whether an action constitutes littering. Without evidence of deliberate misconduct, the charge itself becomes questionable." By now, even the court clerk had stopped typing, her fingers hovering above the keyboard as she listened intently. Spectators whispered among themselves, marveling at Harold's composure and knowledge. Some nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by his ability to dismantle the prosecution's argument piece by piece. Others glanced toward Judge Langley, wondering how he would react to this unexpected display of legal expertise. Judge Langley, however, did not appear impressed. If anything, he seemed increasingly agitated. His brow furrowed deeper with each passing moment, and his grip on the gavel tightened noticeably. To him, Harold's calm reasoning felt like a challenge, a direct affront to his authority. After all, defendants were supposed to be intimidated, submissive, and quick to accept whatever ruling he handed down. But here was Harold Whitaker, coolly pointing out flaws in the system and exposing gaps in the case against him. The judge's patience wore thinner with every word. Unable to tolerate the situation any longer, Judge Langley interrupted abruptly. "Enough!" he barked, slamming his gavel onto the desk with unnecessary force. The sharp sound echoed through the room, startling everyone present. "This isn't a lecture hall, Mr. Whitaker," he snapped, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're not here to teach us about the law. You're here because you've been accused of breaking it. Now sit down and let the court handle this matter." Harold blinked once, unfazed by the judge's outburst. Instead of arguing further, he simply inclined his head politely and responded, "Of course, Your Honor. I apologize if my remarks came across as inappropriate. My intention was only to ensure that the facts are accurately represented." Then, without another word, he returned to his seat, leaving the courtroom buzzing with quiet murmurs of admiration. For a few moments, Judge Langley stared at Harold, his expression unreadable. Perhaps he sensed that something unusual was unfolding, something beyond the typical cases he presided over, but pride prevented him from acknowledging it. Instead, he turned his attention back to the prosecutor and muttered gruffly, "Is there anything else you'd like to add?" The prosecutor hesitated, clearly unsure of what to say next. The foundation of his case had been systematically dismantled by Harold's arguments, leaving little room for rebuttal. Sensing the awkwardness, Judge Langley waved him off impatiently. "Very well," he declared, leaning back in his chair. Based on the evidence presented and despite the defendant's commentary, I find Harold Whitaker guilty of violating the municipal littering ordinance. The fine will be $200. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even those unfamiliar with the nuances of the law could see that the ruling seemed unjust. Harold, however, showed no sign of surprise or frustration. He simply nodded again, accepting the verdict with quiet dignity. As the clerk approached to process his payment, several spectators shook their heads in disbelief, muttering under their breath about the unfairness of it all. Unbeknownst to Judge Langley, his hasty decision would soon come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. What he failed to realize in that moment was that Harold Whitaker was no ordinary defendant. Beneath his humble exterior lay a wealth of knowledge and experience that far surpassed anything the judge, or anyone else in the room, could comprehend. And while Harold may have accepted the fine without protest, the story was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Little did Judge Langley know, the man he had dismissed so callously was about to become the talk of the town, and perhaps the most humbling lesson of his career. As the courtroom began to empty after Judge Langley's ruling, Harold Whitaker remained seated for a moment, collecting his thoughts. He wasn't angry or defeated, just contemplative. To him, this was less about the fine and more about the broader implications of what had just transpired. Justice, he believed, wasn't merely about winning or losing. It was about understanding, fairness, and integrity. And while today's outcome hadn't gone in his favor, he felt confident that truth would eventually find its way to the surface. While Harold waited for the clerk to process his paperwork, a young woman approached him with a clipboard in hand. She introduced herself as Emily Carter, one of the court clerks assigned to assist with administrative tasks. Her tone was polite, but tinged with curiosity. "Mr. Whitaker," she said hesitantly, "I couldn't help but notice how thoroughly you explained everything back there. It was really impressive." Harold smiled warmly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thank you, Miss Carter," he replied kindly. "I've always believed that clarity is key when discussing matters of law. Even if the outcome isn't what we hope for, it's important to ensure that everyone understands the reasoning behind decisions." Emily nodded thoughtfully, then added, "Still, I don't think I've ever seen anyone handle themselves quite like you did in front of Judge Langley. Most people either get flustered or try to argue emotionally, but you," she trailed off, searching for the right words. "You made it sound almost academic." At this, Harold chuckled softly. "Well, I suppose that's fitting," he said with a twinkle in his eye. "After all, teaching is what I've spent most of my life doing." Emily tilted her head, intrigued. "Teaching? What do you mean?" Harold leaned slightly on his cane and gestured toward the bench where they stood. "Perhaps we could sit for a moment," he suggested gently. Once they were both settled, he continued. "For over 40 years, I taught constitutional law at Emerson University. It was a rewarding career, filled with bright students eager to learn about the principles that govern our society. Even now, in retirement, I find myself drawn to discussions about justice and fairness. It's something of a lifelong passion, you might say." Emily's eyes widened in astonishment. "Wait, you're a law professor?" she exclaimed, her voice rising, slightly despite her efforts to stay composed. Several nearby spectators turned their heads, curious about the exchange. "Yes, indeed," Harold confirmed with a modest smile. "Though I prefer to think of myself simply as someone who enjoys sharing knowledge. The law, after all, belongs to everyone. It's not meant to be locked away in ivory towers." Emily sat back, momentarily speechless. Then, glancing around the nearly empty courtroom, she whispered, "Do you mind if I share this with the others? I mean, no one here knows who you really are, not even Judge Langley." "If they did—" Harold raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Please don't feel obligated to say anything on my behalf," he said gently. "This isn't about drawing attention to myself. What happened in there speaks for itself. Besides," he added with a wry grin, "I suspect word will spread soon enough without any help from me." And spread it did. Within minutes, Emily had relayed the revelation to her colleagues in hushed tones. At first, they dismissed it as idle, gossip, a clerical error, or an exaggerated claim. But when Harold's name was cross-referenced with public records, the truth became undeniable. Dr. Harold Whitaker wasn't just some random elderly man caught up in a minor legal dispute. He was a renowned figure in the world of jurisprudence, celebrated for his groundbreaking lectures, published works, and decades of mentoring future lawyers and judges. In fact, many of the very laws Judge Langley enforced daily had been shaped, at least indirectly, by Harold's teachings. The news rippled through the courthouse like wildfire. Court staff gathered in small clusters, whispering excitedly about the unexpected twist. Some pulled out their phones to search for articles or photographs of Harold during his teaching days, marveling at how distinguished he looked even then. Others recalled snippets of his defense earlier that day, realizing only now just how masterful it had been. One paralegal muttered under her breath, "No wonder Judge Langley looked so uncomfortable. He practically got schooled by a legend." Word eventually reached the ears of the journalists stationed outside the courthouse. Reporters often lingered near the steps, waiting for noteworthy cases to emerge, and today's events proved irresistible. A young intern named Jake, tasked with live tweeting updates from the courthouse, overheard fragments of the story and decided to dig deeper. After confirming details with a few willing sources inside, he posted a thread that quickly went viral. Breaking. An arrogant judge just fined a senior citizen $200 for littering, but there's a twist. The defendant? None other than Dr. Harold Whitaker, retired law professor and legendary expert on constitutional law. Jake included photos of Harold leaving the courthouse, looking every bit the dignified scholar, along with screenshots of the absurd citation. His tweets sparked immediate outrage and fascination online. Legal experts chimed in, praising Harold's eloquence during the trial, while criticizing Judge Langley's dismissive attitude. Comments poured in from across the country, with many calling for accountability and others expressing admiration for Harold's grace under pressure. Local news outlets picked up the story shortly afterward, airing segments that featured interviews with former students and colleagues who hailed Harold as a brilliant mentor and advocate for justice. Clips of his past lectures resurfaced, showcasing his passion for educating others about the importance of fairness and due process. Meanwhile, Judge Langley's reputation took a nosedive. Social media users roasted him mercilessly, dubbing him Judge Ignoramus and creating memes mocking his inability to recognize greatness when it stood right in front of him. Back at the courthouse, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Staff members who had previously viewed Harold as just another defendant now treated him with reverence, offering apologies for the judge's behavior and thanking him for his patience. One bailiff even shook his hand, saying, "Sir, it's an honor to meet you. We need more people like you in this world." Harold accepted their kindness graciously, never once gloating or seeking revenge. When asked by reporters whether he planned to appeal the ruling, he simply shrugged and replied, "That's not my focus right now. What matters is ensuring that justice is served, not just for me, but for everyone who walks through those doors." Sometimes lessons come from unexpected places. Unbeknownst to Harold, however, the lesson he'd inadvertently taught Judge Langley was far from over. By the end of the day, calls for accountability had reached the highest levels of the judicial system, forcing the judge to confront the consequences of his arrogance. Little did anyone know this confrontation would lead to a surprising act of humility, and perhaps redemption, for all involved. The story of Harold Whitaker was no longer confined to a single courtroom. It had become a national conversation about respect, wisdom, and the enduring power of knowledge to challenge even the most entrenched systems of authority. By the time evening fell, Judge Richard Langley was seething, not with anger but with a gnawing sense of dread. The day had started like any other, with him presiding over mundane cases and issuing rulings that he believed would go unnoticed by the world. But now, as news of his courtroom blunder spread far beyond the courthouse walls, he found himself at the center of a storm he could neither ignore nor control. The first sign that something was amiss came when his phone began buzzing, incessantly. At first it was just text messages from colleagues asking if the rumors were true. Then came emails from higher-ups in the judicial system, their tone veering between concern and thinly veiled disapproval. By late afternoon, even local reporters were calling his chambers, leaving voicemails requesting comments on the viral story that had taken social media by storm. Each notification felt like a hammer striking an already fragile ego. Langley tried to dismiss the backlash as exaggeration. After all, wasn't this just another example of people blowing things out of proportion online? But as he scrolled through Twitter during a rare quiet moment, he realized the scope of the damage. Memes mocking him, threads dissecting his behavior, and countless comments labeling him as arrogant and incompetent filled his screen. One particularly scathing post read, "Judge Langley fined a law professor for littering. Maybe next time he'll fine Einstein for not knowing physics." It stung more than he cared to admit. Worse still, respected legal experts weighed in, criticizing not only his decision but also his conduct. Prominent attorneys pointed out how Langley's refusal to listen to Harold Whitaker undermined public trust in the judiciary. Law professors across the country used the incident as a teaching moment, highlighting the dangers of hubris and the importance of humility in the courtroom. For every article or tweet praising Harold's composure and expertise, there seemed to be another, condemning Langley's arrogance and haste. As the hours passed, the pressure mounted. His superiors summoned him for an emergency meeting the following morning, demanding answers about why such a high-profile mistake had occurred under his watch. Rumors swirled that disciplinary action might follow, ranging from mandatory sensitivity, training to potential removal from the bench. Even within his own circle of acquaintances, Langley sensed a shift. Friends who once laughed at his sharp wit now avoided eye contact, while others offered awkward condolences as though he were attending his own funeral. Despite the mounting criticism, Langley couldn't shake the image of Harold Whitaker from his mind. The elderly man's calm demeanor, his meticulous dismantling of the charges, and his quiet acceptance of the unjust ruling haunted him. What struck Langley most, however, was the revelation that Harold wasn't just some ordinary citizen. He was a titan in the field of law, someone whose work had likely influenced countless judges, lawyers, and policies. And yet, instead of lashing out or seeking revenge, Harold had handled the entire ordeal with grace and dignity. For the first time in years, Langley felt genuinely humiliated. Humiliation wasn't an emotion he was accustomed to. As a judge, he prided himself on being above reproach, untouchable. Yet here he was, exposed not only as fallible but as woefully unprepared for the complexities of human interaction. He had let his pride blind him, dismissing Harold as just another defendant rather than recognizing the depth of his knowledge and character. It was a mistake that went beyond professional incompetence. It was personal failure. That night, unable to sleep, Langley sat alone in his dimly lit study, nursing a cup of cold coffee. He replayed the events of the day in his mind, examining each moment with brutal honesty. He remembered the way Harold had addressed the court, not with bitterness or defiance, but with clarity and precision. He recalled the murmurs of admiration from the spectators, the subtle nods of approval, and the growing tension in the room as his own irritation boiled over. Most painfully, he thought about the final moments of the trial, when he'd slammed his gavel down and declared Harold guilty, without truly considering the merits of the case. "I messed up," Langley muttered aloud, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. Admitting fault didn't come naturally to him, but denial no longer seemed possible. The evidence was everywhere, in the outrage rippling through social media, in the stern warnings from his superiors, and in the nagging voice inside his head, telling him he'd failed not just Harold, but the very principles of justice he was sworn to uphold. The next morning, Langley arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a somber determination. As he prepared for the day ahead, he made a decision, one that surprised even himself. Summoning the clerk, he instructed her to send a formal request to Harold Whitaker, inviting him back to the courthouse for a private meeting later that afternoon. When the clerk hesitated, clearly skeptical, Langley added firmly, "Tell him I'd like to apologize personally." When Harold received the message, he was initially hesitant. Apologies weren't what he sought, nor did he believe they could undo the harm caused by hasty judgments. Still, something about the sincerity of the request resonated with him. Perhaps it was the opportunity to turn this unfortunate incident into a teachable moment, not just for Judge Langley, but for everyone involved. After careful consideration, Harold agreed to meet. The two men reconvened in Langley's chambers, a small austere room lined with legal texts and framed certificates. Langley stood as Harold entered, extending a hand in greeting. "Dr. Whitaker," he said, his voice steady but tinged with remorse. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Harold accepted the offer graciously, settling into one of the chairs across from Langley's desk. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Langley broke the silence. "I owe you an apology," he began, his gaze fixed firmly on Harold. "My actions yesterday were unacceptable. I allowed my biases and impatience to cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I disrespected not only you but the integrity of this court. That was wrong, and I deeply regret it." Harold studied the judge carefully, searching for signs of insincerity. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "Apologies are meaningful only when accompanied by reflection and growth," he replied gently. "Do you understand why your actions were problematic?" Langley exhaled sharply, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Yes," he admitted. "I underestimated you. I judged you based on appearances rather than substance, and I dismissed your arguments because I saw them as a challenge to my authority. I realize now that justice isn't about asserting power. It's about listening, learning, and making informed decisions." Harold smiled faintly, his expression softening. "You're right," he said. "Justice requires humility, especially in positions of authority. Those who wield power must remember that they serve others, not themselves." Encouraged by Harold's response, Langley pressed further. "Is there anything I can do to make amends?" he asked earnestly. "I want to ensure that this doesn't happen again, not to you and not to anyone else." Harold considered the question thoughtfully before replying. "Education is always a good place to start," he suggested. "Invite me to speak to your colleagues, perhaps at the County Bar Association. Share my insights on fairness, due process, and the importance of treating every individual with respect. If we can use this experience to foster understanding and improvement, then it will have served a greater purpose." To his credit, Langley didn't hesitate. "Consider it done," he said firmly. "I'll arrange everything immediately, The meeting drew to a close. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. Where there had once been tension, there was now mutual respect. Langley escorted Harold to the door, shaking his hand warmly and thanking him for his willingness to forgive. For the first time in years, Langley felt a glimmer of hope, not for redemption necessarily, but for the possibility of becoming a better version of himself. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited eagerly for any updates, cameras ready to capture the fallout. But when Harold emerged, he declined to comment, choosing instead to let the day's events speak for themselves. Inside, Judge Langley returned to his desk, resolved to learn from his mistakes and rebuild the trust he had lost. Though the road ahead would be challenging, both men knew that true justice begins not with punishment but with understanding, and sometimes even the hardest lessons can lead to meaningful change. The days following Judge Langley's apology to Harold Whitaker marked a turning point, not just for the two men involved, but for the entire community. News of their private meeting leaked almost immediately, thanks to courthouse staff who couldn't resist sharing the story with reporters camped outside. While details were scarce, the mere fact that Langley had reached out to Harold, and that Harold had accepted, sparked widespread curiosity and speculation. Social media lit up once again, this time with a mix of skepticism and cautious optimism. Could an arrogant judge truly change? Was it possible for humility to replace hubris in a system often criticized for its rigidity? As promised, Judge Langley wasted no time in arranging Harold's guest lecture at the County Bar Association. The event was scheduled for the following Week-end invitations were extended not only to local attorneys and judges, but also to law students from nearby universities. Word spread quickly, drawing attendees from across the region. For many, it was an opportunity to witness history in the making, a rare moment where accountability and growth intersected in the pursuit of justice. On the day of the lecture, the auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Seats filled rapidly, forcing latecomers to stand along the walls or perch on steps. Cameras flashed as Harold entered the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. Despite his age, he carried himself with the poise of someone accustomed to leading discussions rather than merely participating in them. Beside him walked Judge Langley, whose demeanor had softened noticeably since the trial. Gone was the scowl that once defined him. In its place was a look of quiet determination, as if he understood the weight of what was about to unfold. After brief introductions by the Bar Association president, Harold took the stage. He began by thanking everyone for coming, his voice warm and inviting. "Today," he said, pausing to survey the crowd, "we gather not to dwell on past mistakes, but to focus on how we can improve the future. Justice is not static. It evolves, grows, and adapts based on our willingness to learn." His opening remarks set the tone for the rest of the lecture. Over the next hour, Harold delivered a masterclass in fairness, empathy, and the ethical responsibilities of those entrusted with upholding the law. Drawing from decades of experience, he shared anecdotes about cases that had challenged his perspective, moments when he'd been wrong, and lessons he'd learned along the way. He emphasized the importance of listening to defendants, acknowledging their humanity, and ensuring that every decision was grounded in evidence and reason, not bias or ego. At one point, Harold turned to Judge Langley, seated in the front row, and addressed him directly. "Your Honor," he said kindly, "you've taken a brave step today by inviting me here. It takes courage to admit fault and seek improvement. I commend you for that, and I believe others will follow your example." The audience erupted into applause, some rising to their feet in admiration. Langley, visibly moved, nodded in gratitude, his face flushed with emotion. When Harold concluded his speech, the room erupted into sustained applause. Attendees lingered afterward, eager to speak with him personally. Young law students lined up to ask questions, seeking advice on navigating the complexities of the legal profession. Seasoned attorneys exchanged stories of their own courtroom experiences, inspired by Harold's wisdom and humility. Even Judge Langley joined the conversation, engaging openly with colleagues and participants in a way he never had before. The atmosphere was electric, filled with a renewed sense of purpose and camaraderie. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of Harold's lecture became undeniable. Judge Langley implemented several changes in his courtroom procedures, prioritizing transparency and fairness. He encouraged open dialogue with defendants, allowing them ample time to present their cases without interruption. Clerks and bailiffs noticed a marked shift in his demeanor. He was less impatient, more attentive, and genuinely interested in understanding the nuances of each case. Colleagues remarked on his transformation, noting that he seemed happier and more fulfilled in his role. Beyond the courthouse, the incident sparked broader conversations about judicial reform. Legal organizations cited the story as a powerful reminder of the need for accountability and continuous education within the judiciary. Law schools incorporated the case into their curricula, using it as a case study on the dangers of arrogance and the value of humility. Social media campaigns emerged, celebrating individuals who stood up for fairness and advocated for systemic change. For Harold, the experience reaffirmed his lifelong commitment to teaching and mentoring. Though retired, he found himself increasingly sought after as a speaker and advisor. Requests poured in from universities, nonprofits, and even government agencies, hoping to benefit from his expertise. Rather than retreat into obscurity, Harold embraced these opportunities, viewing them as a chance to leave a lasting legacy. His message remained consistent. Justice is not a destination but a journey, one that requires constant vigilance and self-reflection. As for Judge Langley, he continued to grow in ways he never imagined. What began as a humiliating misstep evolved into a profound awakening, a realization that true leadership stems from service, not authority. He started attending workshops on empathy and conflict resolution, determined to refine his skills further. Slowly but surely, public perception of him shifted. Once ridiculed as Judge Ignoramus, he earned newfound respect for his willingness to confront his flaws and strive for betterment. Months later, during a casual lunch with Emily Carter, the court clerk who had first learned of Harold's identity, Langley reflected on everything that had transpired. "You know," he said thoughtfully, stirring his coffee, "I used to think being a good judge meant never making mistakes. But now I realize that's impossible. What matters is how we respond when we do mess up." Emily smiled, nodding in agreement. "And you handled it well, Your Honor. Not everyone would have had the courage to reach out to Dr. Whitaker like you did." Langley chuckled softly, shaking his head. Courage? Maybe. Or maybe it was desperation. Either way, I'm grateful for the lesson. If anything, this whole experience has reminded me why I wanted to become a judge in the first place, to make a difference, however small. Back home, Harold sat in his favorite armchair, surrounded by stacks of books and notes. Outside, autumn. Leaves swirled in the breeze, painting the world in hues of gold and crimson. As he sipped tea and reviewed drafts of a new article he planned to publish, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The road ahead would undoubtedly bring challenges, but he knew that progress was rarely linear. What mattered most was the collective effort to move forward, together. In the end, the story of Judge Langley and Harold Whitaker served as a testament to the power of redemption, humility, and the enduring pursuit of justice. It reminded everyone involved that even in moments of failure, there lies the potential for growth, and that sometimes the greatest lessons come from the unlikeliest of teachers.